everyone. My name is Yuko Ishihara, and I'll be giving the second talk for today. So my background is in phenomenology, in the philosophical sense, starting with the Husserl tradition. And also I work on Japanese philosophy, mostly modern Japanese philosophy, the Kyoto school tradition in particular. And recently, so I'm part of this Qualia Structure project. And I started learning about category theory. And so I'm generally interested in this, what Robert called mathematized phenomenology. But I'm still a kind of beginner with math and category theory. But today I want to kind of bring up questions that I've been interested in for some time related to this project. And so as you can see, I'm pretty pregnant. I'm due in a few weeks. So hopefully nothing happens during my talk. But yeah, I'm gonna have to probably sit down at some point. I'm also pretty tired in general, so if I start saying something that doesn't make sense, you can just tell me, like, you're not making sense. Cut me off. Okay, so title of my talk is From Intentionality to Basho. So Basho in Japanese means place. Kind of obviously I'll say more about what that means, but it's a concept from Nishida's philosophy, Nishida Kitaro, who's the founder of the Kyoto school tradition. And so I want to move away from this idea of intentionality, defined as this kind of arrow-like consciousness. It's the marker of consciousness according to phenomenology. I want to move away from this idea more to this idea of place, consciousness as a place. Openness, playfulness, and freedom, I put as a kind of subtitle of my talk, as kind of underlying theme. And as I'll say in a bit, there's this kind of, yeah, so as I was saying, this is like openness, playfulness, and freedom are like the underlying motif, the experiential motif of what I'm going to talk about. So recently I published a book that I forgot to bring it here, titled Intercultural Phenomenology, Playing with Reality. And so what I'm going to be talking about today draws a lot on that, but today I'm going to be talking about it more in terms of, well, related to consciousness particularly. So of course, we're all interested in this question of what is consciousness. And the basic assumption I'm working on with is that phenomenology, as this philosophical discipline or approach that started with Edmund Husserl, is a very useful approach for studying consciousness for our experience of reality. So yeah, phenomenology is this useful approach for studying consciousness, right? Thankfully, Robert has already kind of given you enough information about phenomenology so that I don't have to defend this position. But according to phenomenology, the basic axiom, so to say, is that consciousness is always conscious of something for someone, right? So there's this kind of directionality to all of our conscious experience. And Husserl termed this intentionality, right? It's simply this directionality character of our conscious experience. I'm going to call this an arrow-based approach because it's like an arrow, right? Stemming, going from me towards things, objects. It can also come back to you, but it's this arrow-based approach. Now, this arrow-based approach is also a relational approach. Robert also said that there's a primacy of relations in phenomenology, and I think we're talking about the same thing here. But yeah, it's a relational approach in the sense that it takes a relation between subject and object as its basis, right? So this naturally finds common ground with category theory, this phenomenological approach, finds common ground with category theory, of course, because category theory, one of the great ideas of category theory, the way I understand it, is that it moves away from talking about discrete objects to more focusing on the primacy of relations. Now, taking this relation or this arrow as a basis is philosophically significant, right? In that it's a huge development for a more kind of substance-based approach to consciousness. By substance-based approach, I mean starting with discrete objects like Cartesian kind of view, discrete object of subject, or the mind, the body, or mind, and other minds, and then trying to understand how they relate to each other, right? One of the problems of the substance-based approach is understanding how these discrete things can be related at all, right? So we can bypass that problem by starting with just saying that, no, things are related in the first place. So how do we understand this relation? But I want to ask whether this relational approach is sufficient in understanding the structures of consciousness. Is there something more to consciousness than relations/errors? That's the kind of question that I'm interested in. It's an open question. In other words, could we even go further? So we're starting with kind of ontologically speaking, substances. We moved away from that. It's a bit, goes back all the way to Aristotle, of course. We don't want that. We can work with relations. It's a bit more manageable. Could we go even further? What's this kind of alternative category that we might, ontological category that we might be able to find? So the aim of my talk is basically to show how we might be able to understand consciousness as the place of the subject-object relation. I want to try to move away from this emphasis on the subject-object relation to the place that enables the subject-object relation. And this idea is borrowed from Nishida Kitaro, the Japanese philosopher, and I'll say more about that later. So this would allow us to move away from this arrow-based approach, which I'm calling it here a kind of subjectivist approach. But because at the end of the day, all these arrows come back to you. I'll say more about that. But in phenomenology, it comes back to the transcendence of egos. So the arrow-based, one of the problems with at least this sort of the phenomenological arrow-based approach is that it's subjectivist. And so we want to move away from that to a more place-based approach, which is a non-subjectivist approach. So we want to move away from this idea that the subject or the self is at the center of everything. Or at least we might think of the place-based approach as complementing the arrow-based approach. These are open questions. I'm not sure if they should replace it or maybe it can complement it. And importantly, what I want to do in this talk is I want to couple this conceptual understanding of what this might mean, what this place-based approach might mean, with a living understanding of it, right? So we're all working with consciousness studies, right? We're interested in the theory, but at the same time, we're interested in the experience. And as a phenomenologist, I'm interested very much in this actual living understanding of what structures, what it means for this consciousness to be arrow-like or to be like place. So it's very important that we also complement theoretical understanding with a living understanding of it. And that's where I want to start. So I'm going to start with a few exercises that I introduced in my book as a way for us to, it's going to start with a bit of a, kind of like a stretching exercise, a stretching of the mind. And then we're going to try to get a sense of what this place-based approach might mean in our own experiences. So I invite you to play along with me. And thankfully, I do this in my classes as well. And students are great. Young undergrad students are great because they're so flexible and they're not stuck in their theories, right? And so they're really kind of open to playing along. I don't like talking with scholars because they're hard-headed, they're like, yeah, da, 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 and they don't really listen to me. I think this is a great place because you guys are interested in consciousness, right? And you're, I think, ready to play along. So there are 3 sets of exercises here. The first one, we're going to start with playing with imagination. It's a fun one. The main purpose of all this is really to have fun, right? That's what play is all about. So I don't want you to take it too seriously, but I want you to have fun doing it. We're going to start with playing with imagination. We're going to move on to playing with perception. And you might already be thinking, how can we play with perception? And then lastly, play with the subject-object reversal. Okay. So the first thing I want us to do is just take a deep breath. Let's take a couple of deep breaths. I know I definitely need that right now. And maybe your mind has started wondering about different things. Right? I mentioned the word imagination. That probably got you a bit excited. Imagining what to have for lunch. That's all good. But now let's try to bring your focus back to here. Okay? Whatever is around you. Okay? Try to attend to what is actually happening in our experience right now. Okay, so let's start. The first thing I want you to do, and you can do this if it helps you to imagine with your eyes closed, you can do that. You can do this either way, with your eyes open or closed. But I want you to first imagine a unicorn. Okay. You can imagine the unicorn in whatever way you want, but try to really vividly imagine that suddenly in your experience right now, a unicorn appears. Really try to imagine this in every detail as possible. Color, shape, how big is it? Texture, can you feel it? What is it doing? Is it saying something? Is it giving out the name? Now, as you do this, think to yourself, what has changed in your experience? So before you started imagining this unicorn, and now that you have started imagining this unicorn in your experience, what has changed? Okay, now I want you to imagine that you're flying. Yes, it's a flying unicorn. You're flying on this unicorn's back. Okay? Let it take you wherever you want. You're not constrained to this room. Let it take you wherever you want, however high. Let your imagination free. What can you do now that you couldn't do before? How do you feel? And again, think how this current experience of flying on unicorn's back differs from how it was before when you simply imagined this unicorn in front of you. How do you feel now? How has your experience changed? Okay, now, finally, imagine that you have become the unicorn. Okay? No longer are you flying on the unicorn's back. You have become the unicorn. You are the unicorn. You've taken up a whole new identity. What can you do now? All right. Now, hate to say this, but stop imagining and come back to your perception to here. Okay. You might be pulled back by your imagination. You might want to go back to being the unicorn, but just try to really, I'm here, try to focus on the here and now. And ask yourself, okay, what feels more real? Your imaginary world that you were living in temporarily just now, or your actual world, this world? What feels more real? Any thoughts on the exercise? How do you feel now?
Actually, I lost my idea. I'm sorry.
What?
So certainly more relaxed to answer the last question, but what I thought about this exercise is that it enforces a perspectival shift. So it made me reconsider the relation of observership. First, I observed the unicorn maybe in front of me. I imagined a black unicorn coming into the room, stopping here, looking at me. It had a black, hornia and like big black wings. I have a question for black, obviously. But then I imagined riding it, and then I imagined becoming it. So it was a morphing of my own individuality into the object. So what was object became subject, became me, and I suppose that's the point of the exercise.
And how did you feel later on?
Like with the immersiveness into the objecthood, into the object of perception, becoming that object, it felt not only more real than coming back to perception and looking at you and looking here. It felt quieter and calming in a sense, because the entire world was me being seated into that object that I became the object. So yeah.
Into this imaginary object.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So first of all, my curiosity would be how many people actually imagined the wing before hearing that it was an actual flying unicorn, because personally I didn't, and then some wings appeared after. So that's something I would be curious to know. And for me, there wasn't the shift in perspective that Robert mentioned. Actually, it always felt like a continuum, a subjective continuum. I was still a subject, and actually I would say I was the same subject, just the word and what I could do within the word was completely different.
Right. But you took on different possibilities.
Yeah.
Right. But you still felt the same you.
Maybe not the same me, but like I felt a continuum between me right now in this setting and me as someone who was touching the unicorn first and then flying with it and then becoming it.
Okay, good. Thank you.
No, my question rather would be how many people closed their eyes, how many didn't. That was actually I'm curious to know that. But no, to me the interesting point was that the entire playing, the entire game, became way more real when I started to think of riding unicorn. Until it was just here, I was like, yeah, okay, whatever. But then I started to interact with it. Okay, then it became way more. I became more involved in it, first person. So I actually felt more into the game. If you, just to call it a game, as you mentioned. Yeah, that was interesting.
Good.
I guess I thought that was interesting because I kind of had the opposite experience where it was a lot easier for me to imagine a unicorn. And I wonder if part of that for me was I was very aware of what physiological feelings I could be feeling. So I wasn't necessarily feeling like it in my body, but I could imagine feeling this like circular openness when I saw a unicorn. So like that's so interesting. And then writing on it, imagining the feeling, but not necessarily feeling the fear of like I'm high up and that feeling you get when you are high up. And then when I entered the horse, I had to shift to how does the physiology of this unicorn, horse, whatever, feel. And so I was trying to imagine like having muscles that are in places that I don't like, just the spatial embodiment. I was trying to like get in that. So that was like the hardest for me.
Yeah. To me, it was funny because there were like 3 stages, right? The first one it was quite natural. Like I was seated here passively just watching the unicorn unfold. And the last part in which I was the unicorn, it was also quite natural. Like it was still like a first person active perspective. The second step that to you sounded natural to me was the weirdest one, because I was riding and I was constant. It was quite unstable whether I was looking from a third person perspective, like someone riding a unicorn, or if I was the person. So it was weird. Like it wasn't very natural. To me.
Yeah.
The third and the first step were more in place.
More natural. Interesting. Okay, I'm gonna move on. I love that you are reflect. Does anyone really want to? Just wanna? Sure.
Oh, maybe just a quick
Sure.
one. So thank you for the great meditation. And apart from others told about their subjective experience, one interesting thing was like inside the unicorn. So when I was inside the unicorn, I was like something like an empty object. So because I don't have any conceptual knowledge about what unicorns actually do, what they feel. So what are their intention, what are their targets, etc. So I felt, well, something like emptiness or nothingness. It was very calm, very calm. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, very interesting observations. Thank you. Okay, so the aim of this series, this series of the first series of exercises, playing with imagination, was to gain a sense of freedom, a bit of freedom from the actual self and the actual role that we're living in, right? So at the first stage, when we started imagining this fictional figure, right? The background is still your actual role. We are here, right? And a sort of opening was created in this actual world. But the basis, again, is still the actual world. When we started imagining flying on the unicorn's back, the kind of boundary between the imaginary and the actual started to blend in a bit more, I would say. Because now you have started to take on different possibilities, right? You can now fly, something we cannot normally do. So it gives you a sense, a bit of freedom, right? So there's an interaction between this world and yourself and the imaginary world that we have created in our minds. In the third stage, when you became the unicorn, this is where there's more sense of freedom, I would say. You're free to do whatever you want because this imaginary creature is up to you. You know, the possibilities are open, right? Infinite, I would say. So you were really living in your imaginary world, very free to do whatever you want, right? But at the same time, there's still this kind of background sense that maybe you couldn't be completely free from yourself. Even though you took up a new identity, you were still in some sense, as you said, your old self, actual self, right? And then lastly, when I told you to stop imagining and come back to this reality, there is really the sense of coming back to reality, right? There's maybe a sort of sadness to it because you have to let go of that, but there's a sense of, okay, we're back to this reality. So I would say the series of exercises is a very good stretching exercise for the mind, but it's not really enough to change our minds about reality. Namely, that reality is this objective reality. and that we're part of this objective reality. So I want to go a bit further in the second series of exercises, playing with perception. Let's again start by observing what is around this room. So if you've already spent one day in this room, a bit more familiar with other people around you, right? Just become a bit more acquainted with everything that's around you. Feel all the objects' presence, feel your sense of presence in this room. All right. Now, imagine that everything around you is now a realistic painting, okay? What you're seeing around you is just a very realistic painting. So in other words, it's not real. What you're seeing is not real. It's just an image. That's right. The painting. Okay? It's all a painting. Okay, now stop imagining and return to your straightforward perception of your surroundings, right? In other words, it's not an image. This is not an image, right? It's real. Now switch back. Do the transition a couple of times. Make this into a painting again. Play with that for a few seconds, minutes, and then return to your straightforward perception. Now, we're gonna redo this transition, but I want you to set aside what is said in the parentheses, okay? So first, we imagined this to be a painting, but in doing so, we interpreted the experience as not real, right? It was just an image. And when we went back to our straightforward perception, we interpreted this experience as being real. It was not a mid-image. It was real, right? What I want you to do now is to try to suspend judgment about what is said in the parentheses, with one being real and one being just an image. In doing so, I want you to just focus on what is given to your experience, right? Let things appear to you as perceived in your straightforward perception, and let things appear to you as an image in your imagination when you are seeing these things as painting. Now ask yourself, has your sense of reality changed at all? Do you feel your perceptual experience is real as ever compared to the imaginary experience? Or is it better to say that perceptual experience appears more real because of the way you relate to the objects in your experience? similarly, is imaginary experience less real? Or does imaginary experience somehow, or imaginary objects somehow appear less real because of the way you relate to those objects in your imagination? Yeah. Well, you can think about it first and then happy to.
I have a hard time switching from this, like imagining that this is just a painting from it's being real. And for me, it was hard because there was different like perspective. If some things are moving, that was hard to me to really think of it as a painting. But if I even achieve that, for me, this like sense of reality was not changed. Like I felt the same about it.
I'll just speak. I usually don't have an aphantasia. You probably know about this, right? If people here might be, some of you are having a hard time in imagining things as you are asking to do, and they're probably doing so in just a concept, right? Probably some people are. But in my case, this particular case was extremely difficult. Maybe it's because the cognitive knowledge is interfering because I'm probably too old, but the stereo thing just interferes with me to imagine things or feel it as a painting. I just cannot do it. So I just kept on closing one of the eyes. Otherwise, I just see this alternation of the depths kind of, thing happening all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
So I just couldn't do it.
Okay.
Yeah. For me, it was surprisingly easy in the beginning, but then it was when you said start imagining and stop imagining. But when we actually moved on to the second part and you told us to switch back and forth, and when we were supposed to do it on our own pace, so to say, it was much harder because in the beginning I felt like everyone was in on it, even though everyone's experience was like very different, as everyone thinking of themselves as real and not the others as real. It just became harder when we were told to do it on our own pace, but it definitely affected how I perceived reality. Okay.
Yeah, so following on what Nao said, as a person with aphantasia, I wouldn't. So obviously, it doesn't feel for me as like stuff is changing actually, because it's not an if else situation. So for me, it's rather like both of the things exist in the sense. So the conceptual imagining is kind of layered on top of my normal experience. So it never fades away. The perceptual stuff that I have, it's always feels real and normal. But then there is this imaginative part of like being a unicorn, which is in some sense as a concept fully real at the same time, if it needs to be, and if not, then just gone. So in one sense, it's really easy to do those exercises because they don't involve any like forcing myself with my normal perception or my normal thinking. But on the other hand, they are not exactly what probably most of the people are doing. So hard to say if it's actually the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Now I'm confused what I had, but I just want to say that for me it feels like it's easy to switch between the two, so between like real versus like the painting, and it was what was changing mainly was like my my perspective. So when it was a painting, I was feeling like I'm in a bubble kind of, and it's like only me and everything else is just kind of outside. And then I was like bringing back myself into out. I was going out of the bubble when I was imagining again things are real because I can interact. And it was like switching constantly for this.
Yeah, good. Right. So I'm gonna move on because I realize the aim of this series of exercises, playing with imagination, was to discover an open self, right? That is free from the ties to the so-called reality, right? Before it was more of a stretching exercise, but this was to become a bit more open. So the first one, when we were just normally perceiving, this is the way we normally understand perception and imagination, right? The perceived world is our real world. Imaginary world is less real. Somehow it's in our mind, right? That's the usual conception that we started off with. So it was confirming our kind of preconception of what we mean by reality. Then what we did when I asked you to set aside what is said in the parenthesis of interpreting one experience being more real than the other, we set aside our powerful belief, namely that perception is our window to the outside reality, and what we imagine is in our heads and hence less real. Once we were able to, and I wonder to what extent you were really able to do this, but once you were able to do that, basically what you were doing, what I was asking you to do, was to suspend judgment about whether or not what we experience accords with an outside reality. Okay, so similar to appreciating a story, by suspending judgment on whether it's fictional or not, you start to appreciate the story for what it is, right? Similarly, we start to appreciate things, what's appearing to you in your experience, just as they present themselves to us in your experience. Okay. If you were able to do this, you were effectively taking up the phenomenological attitude. Okay. By setting aside our assumption that this is reality, you're able to just purely focus on how things appear to you in your experience. Now, if you were able to adopt this sort of perspective, then you may observe that perception allows us to do things that imagination doesn't, and vice versa, right? So perception, for example, allows you to touch things. Even when you actually don't do it, you have a sense that you can do that. There's the other side of the desk, right? If you were to go move around, you'd be able to touch it. Imagination wouldn't, imagining that it's a painting, you wouldn't be able to do that. Rather, if you go up, you'd be touching this kind of painting texture, right? So it prompts different sort of affordance, right, and your experiences. So it's not that perceptual experience is more real, but it appears more real because of the way we relate to these perceived objects and the possibilities that are open to us. And likewise, it's not that imaginary experience is less real. It appears less real because of the way we relate to imagined objects. There are different ways in which things appear to us or present themselves to us in our experience. Imagination allows us to do things that perception doesn't. For example, the main thing is that it allows us to make present what is not there, right? You're actually making present what is not there, as when you imagine the unicorn, right? It's not that it's less real, it's actually a making present. So, taking this observation a bit further, reality is not some pre-established thing we must obey, but it's actually a specific way we apprehend the appearance of things. In other words, reality is a story we tell ourselves, right? And we are the storytellers of our reality. So what is the self that's making these observations? This is a very important question to ask. It's neither the actual self that's caught up in this actual practical world with all your concerns and worries, nor is it an imaginary self that's momentarily escapes from it, but this self that's making all these observations, we can call it the phenomenological self. Or I prefer to just call it the open self. You've become a bit more open to what is happening in your experience. So the open self has gained a bit more freedom by discovering that the sense of what is real issues not from some outside pre-established reality, but from ourselves. Again, we are the storytellers of reality, of our story. I'm not expecting you to have made these observations. Taking up the phenomenological attitude requires a bit of training. It's a very unnatural attitude, as they say. But if you're able to get a bit of a glimpse in it, that would have been nice. Do you have a question? Yeah.
Just a quick one. This feeling of being more real or not, could it be that it's just dependent on the state of conscious experience itself? That perception and imagination are kind of in competition. Like for instance, when we are dreaming, I think that we feel that it's super real, it's hyper real, and we have even like haptic senses of interacting with stuff in our dreams, right?
Yeah.
So maybe it's like that. It's not so much that it's kind of coupled to how we are letting those two mechanisms kind of maybe enter consciousness.
Two mechanisms as in perception, imagination.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess this exercise was a way to actively change from one to the other. But often we are just kind of making a natural transition. And sometimes they are in competition, sometimes not. But the purpose was to become a bit more of an observer to what's happening when this transition happens. Okay, I'm going to move on to the third exercise, the most exciting one. Let's take any object that's in front of you. Okay, choose an object, whatever it is that you want. Choose an object, then observe your experience. First take an object, then observe your experience of the object. Observe the way you feel the object being over there, right, in front of you, being separate from you. There's a sense that you are here observing the object that is over there. Now, let's reverse this relation. Let the object look at you. When I say this, I don't mean to take up a sort of metacognition. It's really what you're trying to do is to give up the role of the subject. Okay? In Japanese, subject is shu. It means host. Give up the role of being the host to your experience and try to become the object. In Japanese, it's kaku, meaning object. Guest. Okay? So you're no longer the host of your experience. Try to be the guest to your experience. Let the object take care of you. If you feel that this is a very odd thing that I'm asking you, just stay with that oddity. Try not to understand it cognitively. Just try to see if it can really be reversed in your experience. Now try the subject-object reversal with other experiences. We started off with visual perception, but we're going to try it with other experiences. So instead of thinking about what to have for lunch, let the thought think of you. Okay? Be a guest to your thoughts. Instead of you remembering your childhood, try to let the memory remember you. Be a guest to your memory. Instead of you imagining the unicorn, let the imagination imagine you. Be a guest to your imagination. And in all these cases, try reversing the relation of being the subject, the host, and the object, being the guest, and observe the differences in how you feel.
Sorry, I'm a bit lost. I don't understand how to do it. So I have a question because I think it is a crucial point. So I really want to understand. One way to try to do that is that, especially when I have an object or the unicorn it's I imagine I am the unicorn that's thinking about Matteo, or I imagine I am the chair and I'm looking back at me and I'm sitting out there. But for the memory, I don't understand how to imagine the memory remembering me. Can you
Yeah.
say something more about that?
Yeah. So when you remember your childhood, you think that it's your memory. What I'm asking you to do is try to let go of that you. Right? Just get immersed in that memory and try to just see if you can be that memory. Yes, if that makes sense. And likewise, it's with thinking and thoughts. We think that all our thoughts are yours, my thoughts. But try to let go of that my perspective and try to just become the thought. If that makes sense at all.
I was wondering, how does this differ from the type of typical meditation approach where you observe your thoughts and so you remain passive and just see what kind of thoughts and memories come to you? How does this differ from that approach?
Maybe there's something similar to it. Yeah. Okay, now, if you were successful at all, see if you can neither be the subject nor the object, neither the host nor the guest. Okay, can you try being the stage, so to say, upon which the subject and object play their roles, upon which the host and guest play their roles? In other words, can you just witness the play without either being the host nor the guest? Instead of you looking at an object or the object looking at you, they're just looking. Instead of you thinking about lunch or the thought thinking of you, there is just thinking. Okay, ask yourself now, where am I now? What is the self that is witnessing the subject object play? Any observations? I'm only going to take two because I.
Thank you for this really interesting exercise. Like Matteo, I found it really difficult when you first described what we should do. I really don't think I succeeded in becoming the object as such. And I think actually what I was trying to do, or what came naturally, was just to eliminate the subject. So it's not that I was becoming this chocolate wrapper, but rather just I wasn't me or I. There was no I. So maybe it was more like the third or the second part.
Yeah.
I found that kind of more intuitive to do.
Okay. And how did you feel after that? Where did you feel that you were?
I mean, to be honest, I think I was still here. But I was trying to let that go. When you said let go of the subject, that was really helpful.
Good. Thank you. One more observation by somebody?
I was already asking, so
Yeah, I actually find this a lot easier to do than the other sorts of exercises. I find it's like quite straining to like imagine a unicorn and imagine objects that aren't there. But Yeah, imagining, not imagining, but looking at an object and kind of reversing the role seems to come quite naturally, and this sense of self very quickly dissipates into this sort of recognition of everything as just experience. And I really like the idea of looking at it not as subject or object, but as being the stage. And I immediately kind of had this kind of visualization of just like a collection of phenomenal objects, and thoughts kind of became just as real as like physical things as well.
Very good. And how would you describe your sense of self?
Pretty gone, but like the second I step out of that exercise, it immediately comes back.
Yeah.
There's like not a self there.
Good, very good. Okay, so the aim of this last series of exercises was to explore an even more open self, where the appearances are no longer yours, but are simply there. In the first part, when you have to give up the role of the subject or the host, the key here is to give up control, right? We are actually making a lot of effort trying to control our experiences and grasp. There's a lot of grasping on our part. So I think that was the key point. Then the second one, when I asked you to try it out with different experiences, maybe some experiences were more difficult than others, some were more easier. We tend to think that thinking is something that really belongs to you, that you do the thinking, right? So there's a lot of doing on our part, so maybe it was more difficult. But with memory, sometimes, you know how some random smell kind of transports you back to your childhood memory or something like that. There's a sense, and when that sort of thing happens, you're invited as a guest to your memory. So I think there's something about memory that allows us to kind of let go of this sense of control that we normally have as the subject or host of our experience. Also with imagination, the spontaneity and playfulness of imagination could lead to imagination taking a life of its own, right? With the unicorn example, if you were really imaginative, you were pretty much letting imagination play itself out. So there was simply imagination playing itself out, not so much you doing it, but it was kind of you just playing along with it. So maybe some experiences were a bit more easier than others. And lastly, I asked you to give up both roles of being subject and object. There was a sense of sitting back and enjoying the play of reality. You're just witnessing all of this happening. And here we can begin to appreciate more of the dynamic happening of the subject-object play. I think when you said that you were kind of able to see all these different kind of experiences from a bit more of a detached perspective, maybe that's what was happening. So in this last stage, we can choose to play the role of the subject or the host, if you chose to do so, or you could choose to play the role of the guest or the object. But importantly, we don't have to identify with either, right? Because you're just the stage. And I say that this is a sort of freedom from identification. Like at the very experiential level, it gives us a very kind of significant sense of freedom because we don't have to identify ourselves as this or that thing. Okay, so how far have we come with these exercises? Well, we began with our usual understanding of reality as existing out there separately from us. All right, this is a kind of naive or direct realist view. We then, for those of you who are able to get a glimpse into it, moved past this naive realist understanding of reality and adopted a phenomenological perspective, where reality is now understood as a specific way in which we apprehend the appearance of things. Right? So this is more of a relational approach. You realize that reality is not just there and we're just kind of mirrors of that reality or trying to mirror that reality, but we are actually the storytellers of our reality, of our story, as I said. It's also, metaphysically speaking, anti-realist in the sense that you now do not believe that the reality is something that is there for us to obey. Finally, we explore the possibility of going beyond this subjective take on appearances They're trying to let go of the role of the subject. So through these exercises, I'm hoping that we made some progress towards a living understanding of consciousness as a place. When I said try to become that stage where you're witnessing, experimentally, that's what it means to be the place of appearances. And philosophically, I've called this position awakened realism, because we're actually put back to this reality. We're back in touch with reality, much more real than what direct naive realism has to say. I won't go too much into that. Okay, so that was the exercise part for you to get a living understanding of what I'm trying to say. Now I want to talk a bit more about the kind of conceptual part, starting with Husserl. So we've already saw a bit into Husserl. He's the founder of Phenomenology. Phenomenology is study of consciousness from the first person perspective. And for Husserl, the aim was to clarify the invariant structures of our experiences, right? Try to extract the essence. The basic principle, which he called the principle of all principles to his phenomenology, was to appeal to what is directly given to us in our experience, just as it is, just as it presents itself to us, nothing more and nothing less. So we're sticking with experience and we're not leaving experience. Okay. That's the basic principle behind phenomenology. Now, normally, when we attend to objects, when we look at objects, observe objects, we're not, when we look at our experiences, we're attending to objects and not so much our experience of objects, right? Even when we are attending to our experience of objects, we tend to smuggle in a lot of various theories about the mind or brain, right? And leave the domain of what is actually directly given to us in our experience. This is just the nature of how we are. We tend to interpret what is there in front of us. So in order to stay true to the principles of all principles, how can we stay with what is directly presented to us in our experience? We need some sort of method that would allow us to do that. And Husserl's method was suspension of judgment, that what he called the phenomenological epoche. He called this bracketing, also putting out of play our belief that the world and objects in it exist independently of us, right? This naive realist understanding of the world. And this method is called the phenomenological epoche, where epoche in ancient Greek means suspension of judgment. Now, importantly, suspension of judgment about the existence of the world and object doesn't mean we stop talking about them. This is a very common misunderstanding of phenomenology, where they say phenomenology is exclusively interested in mental experience and not interested in the external world. That is a mistaken view, because what the phenomenological epoche actually allows us to do is to re-engage with the world and objects in a new light, free from the prejudice that this, whatever is appearing, accords or does not accord with an outside reality. So we're still very much interested in objects and the world. We're just trying to re-engage with it in a different light, namely the phenomenological light, right? Where we're just focusing on what appears and what presents itself to us in our experience. So we stop interpreting objects as existing in such and such way, whatever that may be, based on the theories, based on the ideas that we have, and focus on what's purely given to us in our experience. And this is called the phenomenological reduction. Reduction in the sense of the Latin reducere, meaning to lead back. We come back, lead our gaze back to what is just given to us in this experience. So it doesn't have the usual sense of reduction, of diminishing in size. So then what does phenomenological reflection, which basically is a combination of the epoche and the reduction, allow us to do? Well, what we did was we bracketed our practical concerns with objects. And by doing so, it essentially allows us to see more. And this is actually pretty close to the aesthetic attitude. So for example, this is a picture, painting by Latour on the three peaches. When I first saw this picture, I was amazed, and I was just kind of standing there in front of it for a very long time, because I felt like for the first time I was being taught what peaches actually look like. Right. What the painter does is it brackets what we normally understand by peaches as something that's, you know, juicy and something nice to eat, right? Something that we can grab and just wash and eat. It brackets all that and lets you focus on what is actually happening in your experience. What makes this peach look like a peach, right? What is happening in your experience? And it's very rich. And the painter is able to see that and capture that and express it. The phenomenological attitude is something very similar. By bracketing our practical concerns, focus on the kind of the outside, or the kind of the thing as a thing in itself, you can refocus on what is actually given to you on the experiential side. So essentially, phenomenology allows us to see more, right? So by bracketing the what is given in our experience, we can focus on how it is given to our experience. For example, you know, peaches are yummy, peaches make great art, tart, sorry, the peaches species of blah, blah, blah. All of this we bracket and we focus on how it is given to us in our experience. Right? Slightly rough, hairy texture, there's a gradation of colors. The other side is given, though not is not given, right? In direct intuitive experience, but it's somehow intended, it's somehow experienced. You have a sense that it's there. There is also a sense that I can pick it up and bite into it, right? So our embodiment is also involved in how we see. All of this how is something that we can now focus on after this bracketing. And once we do that, we can start extracting the invariant patterns. So you might be able to compare visual perception with imagination. One sort of essence that we might extract is that in visual perception, the peach doesn't disappear even when I stop looking at it, whereas in imagination, it will disappear when I stop, imagining it. That means that the imagined object is dependent on the imagining consciousness. Sartre says that the imagining consciousness produces and conserves the object as imaged, right? And so a descriptive phenomenologist, the job of the descriptive phenomenologist is to extract these invariant patterns in our various experiences. What's important about all this is that once you start to focus on how things are given to you in our experiences, you realize that at the root of all this, consciousness gives the world meaning. There is a sense-giving consciousness at the very end of all this. Yuso called this transcendental subjectivity. He called it transcendental intersubjectivity, in fact, because this meaning is co-constituted with other people, right? It's not just you giving meaning. Yeah. Yeah, so it's not a contradiction, because when we talk about the object there, the peach, that remains even when we stop looking at it, that object is still the object of our experience. We've left the realm of talking about object in the naive realist sense, right? So that's still an object as experienced.
But what I'm saying is, like, when you look at it again, it reappears, but it disappears the moment you stop looking at it.
That's when we imagine, right?
No, even with, like, so there is this phone, I'm perceiving it. Now I'm not seeing it, so there is no phone. Now I open it and it's there again.
Right, but there's still a sense in our perception. The difference between perception and imagination there, you say, is that when you perceive the phone, even when you're not seeing it, there's a sense that it's still there. In the sense that other people can look at it,
Yeah.
Right? If you were to open your eyes, you would still
Oh,
find
no,
that there's that
for-
expectation, anticipation.
That's for sure. Yes, yes. But I'm saying, like, if you embrace the view that meaning come from conscious experience, it seems to me that this applies to every content of conscious experience, including perception, and therefore without perception there is no object. But maybe we can talk about it later.
Yeah. Maybe I want to continue if that's okay. Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. Sorry. Okay, so the phenomenological attitude is the adoption of a specific, it's a very unnatural attitude, right? It's unnatural because you are bracketing this very basic assumption that we have. So normally we take up what Husserl calls the natural attitude, where we assume the existence of things and the various meanings that they have for us, right? Where we're focused on the what. By bracketing this assumption, we redirect our focus to how things present themselves just as they appear to us, which is to say we redirect our focus to phenomena, which is normally hidden to us, where we don't really pay attention to it. So the phenomenological attitude essentially allows us to be more open to this, what's actually happening, the richness of our experience. So Husserl opened up the path to study conscious experience as phenomena, and this was pretty a big thing. And it also revealed the existence of this sense-giving subjectivity at the heart of conscious experience. But I want to ask, is our experience necessarily subjective? Okay. Don't we have various experiences where the subject takes less center stage? Right. Husserlian phenomenology, I am kind of diluting it a bit, but I think we can generally say that it is based on this idea that at the roots of experience, there is a sense-giving subjectivity. Okay? In that sense, it's very subjective. But my question is, don't we have other experiences where the subject is not so much taking center stage? And here I want to turn quickly to Gadamer and Ricoeur on hermeneutic phenomenology. And we're going to be focusing on the experience of understanding, whether it's understanding another person, another text, culture, or tradition. What makes understanding possible? This was the question that interested hermeneutic phenomenologists, which is this kind of movement of phenomenology that really started with Heidegger. But this was also the question that interested people like Gadamer and Ricoeur. And the main focus of hermeneutic phenomenology is to understand and interpret historical meanings in cultural media, both linguistic, like written text, but also non-linguistic, like in art. Now, if we want to understand another person or a text or a culture, we need to be willing to listen and learn something new, right? Something other than what we already know. And that means that we must be willing to change our views if needed. That means that understanding involves a back and forth movement of adjusting your views and re-engaging with what is provided with the other from a new perspective. And Gadamer called this dynamic movement the play of understanding. Now, when we play a game, we submit to the rules of the game and hand yourself over to the rules of the game, right? There's a sense in which you kind of let go of your usual practical commitments. So this involves a bracketing or suspending judgment on our commitments to the practical rules. We're naturally doing this when we play games or when we play in general. We don't really focus on this bracketing aspect, but we're doing it. And likewise, when we engage in understanding, whether that's of another person or another text, we have to bracket our commitments to our own standpoints and immerse ourselves in the play of understanding. This involves a sort of letting go of agency, right? As a player of understanding, you can't really control the course of the understanding. If you were to do so, then you wouldn't really be engaging in a genuine sort of understanding. If you really want to understand another person or a topic that you're engaging with another person, you have to sort of let go of control, of controlling how this dialogue, conversation is going to unfold. So in that sense, like with play in general, as Gadamer says, all playing is being played. There's a sense in which we're letting the sort of game or game of understanding play itself out. There's a sense of letting go of agency. And Paul Ricoeur, this French phenomenologist, applies this analysis on the play of understanding to reading and writing a work of fiction. In order to engage with the imaginary world of fiction, we have to bracket the meaning horizons, which is basically the possibilities of meanings that form the background of our understanding of our everyday life, right? We have to bracket this in order to really get immersed in the fictional world. Again, we probably don't do this intentionally, but we are doing so when we get immersed. Paul Ricoeur calls this distanciation. It's basically bracketing. Husserl's bracketing reinterpreted. And then he says, as we get immersed in the fictional world, we acquire new meaning horizons, new possibilities, right? And this he calls appropriation. So distanciation is the bracketing of our everyday world. Appropriation is to make one's own what was initially alien, okay, to make one's own. And what's really interesting here is appropriation. Appropriation is not about the reader imposing his or her views or understanding onto the text. He calls this the narcissism of the reader. It's also not about recovering and identifying with the understanding of the original audience of the text. Rather, the reader must let go of her own ego's grasping for meaning and let the meaning of the text reveal itself from itself. So he calls this the relinquishing of the subject. If you really want to understand a text or another person, you have to really just kind of let go of this ego that's constantly trying to impose your understanding, trying to grasp for meaning. He calls this also the disposition of the narcissistic ego. And when we look at how understanding works, we find that it involves the bracketing of our commitments to our views and positions. And this essentially involves bracketing the self, right? We must be willing to set aside the controlling self, our agency, to some extent, in order to immerse ourselves in the play of understanding. And by letting go of our commitments to our own perspectives, we can also freely adopt new perspectives and even new identities. This is what you were doing when you became the unicorn. If you were really successful, you were bracketing your own sense of self, and you were able to take up a new identity. And when you're able to do that, you become very playful. So, hermeneutic phenomenology went a long way towards getting rid of the subjectivist tendencies in Husserl's version of phenomenology. With their emphasis on play, what they did was they foregrounded the dynamic and circular kind of movement between the subject and the object, right? In Paul Ricoeur's case, between the reader and the text, or the reader or the person and another person. So it's not just an arrow. It's still arrow based on an arrow, but it's a more dynamic and circular movement. So contrary to Husserl's emphasis on the sense-giving subjectivity, here there's an emphasis on giving up a sense of subjectivity. And at the experiential level, this leads us to feel more playful. So Husserl allowed us to be more open to phenomena. Hermeneutic phenomenology allows us to be a bit more playful by giving up your sense of subjectivity. Now, even though the arrow has become dynamic, now it's a two-way kind of relation, it's still an arrow-based approach, right? That's why it essentially makes it phenomenology in the traditional sense. So could we go even further? And that's where I want to introduce Nishida, but I think we're up. Time is up. Yeah, sounds good. Yeah.
Thank you for your great talk. I don't understand what you mean by what, but I think it's similar to the concept of image by Bergson. I think, but is that correct?
I'm not sure. Well, what I mean by what is that when I look at this bottle, usually we're just focusing on the object, right?
Yeah, image is have both reality and imaginary.
Okay.
So both
Yeah.
So, and a perception is embodied image. We say that your concept is similar to that.
Okay, it might be, yeah. By bracketing the sense of what is given, the object that supposedly exists in itself, right, separately from us, we can just focus on how it's given to us, the relation we have with this thing. When we do that, so we're focusing on intentionality, we're focusing on this side, so my perception of it, but we're also focusing on, we can also focus on the object as perceived. So there's, they call it in the phenomenology, we call it the noesis and the noema, but we can focus on both sides. If we put an arrow, you can focus on the starting point of the arrow or the end point of the arrow. Phenomenological analysis consists of both analysis.